No witness competent to testify about American war crimes of Vietnam will be denied a hearing. So declared the members of the newly formed Russell Tribunal in November 1966. And a year later, the Russell Tribunal had conducted public hearings at 2 separate locations in Scandinavia, as we heard, Stockholm and Roskilde, where hundreds of witnesses contributed. And as we heard from Russ, the Russell Tribunal brought together intellectuals, scientists, artists, and activists from across the globe to apply the form and language of international law in order to document, judge, and dramatically publicize American actions in Vietnam. And the result, in my view, was both an elaborately staged protest against American imperialism and an ambitious fact-finding exercise that generated an overwhelming body of testimonial evidence. And my research focuses on that testimonial evidence and on witnessing practices more generally at the public hearings of the Russell Tribunal in 1967. And I argue that the Russell Tribunal established a form of knowledge activism in which public testimony from experts, on-site investigators, perpetrators, and victims were used as means of both knowledge production and political protest. So how did the Russell Tribunal deal with its lack of official mandate and juridical legitimacy? I believe that a key tactic was to diffuse the apparent illegitimacy of the tribunal and the partiality of its members, the panel of judges, through a diverse plurality of witnesses. But in this talk, instead of providing a broad overview of my dissertation, apologies, Russ, because I just don't have time. So instead, what I'll do is I'll zoom in on just 4 concrete research findings. So 1 for each of these witness categories I mentioned and that I will repeat. And I'm doing this in order to demonstrate the benefits of focusing on witness testimony as a way of understanding the Russell Tribunal and its operational logic and its impact. And in my work, witness statements and witness categories provide the empirical basis as well as the analytic framework. We saw a similar image from Russ. This is the panel or part of the panel in Stockholm. So a key point of mine is that the respective witness categories, so again, experts, on-site investigators, perpetrators, and victims, represent very different models of epistemic authority. So each witness category has acquired their knowledge about the war, and so their credibility and legitimacy to speak on it in very different ways. What makes a good witness varies. There's no generic witness credibility. And the Russell Tribunal, to me, illuminates the curation of witness authority, credibility, and legitimacy across a range of witness categories within a single pioneering form of political protest. Or put differently, the Russell Tribunal as a case of how distinct yet complementary sets of witness testimony were generated and put to use in service of a political goal, that is US withdrawal and Vietnamese self-determination. And one way of illustrating this witness diversity is through a solar system analogy. And these circles or orbits represent each category's distance from the violence of war, with experts inhabiting the outer, most remote circle and with victims at the core. So this is admittedly an incomplete and rather superficial image, but we can think of each circle as representing not only physical distance from the war zone, but also a set of characteristics, including self-presentation, attitude, mode of speech, narrative strategy, and epistemic method. That is, each circle represents a particular way not only of acquiring knowledge, but also of communicating it to an audience. And these circles of witnessing illustrate the shifting and complementary value of the objective and the subjective as a source of witness authority and credibility, from the dispassionate methodologies of experts to the radical subjectivity of victims. So I'm now going to just dip in to to my dissertation and give you 4 examples of how this functions in each witness category, or rather, I'm going to give you 4 findings that I have, or 4 research results that I found thanks to this analytic, to really focus in on the witness statements of the witness categories. So first, experts. This is a Japanese scientist demonstrating a cluster bomb unit, I believe, for the panel. So expert witnesses were characterized by distance. They didn't visit the war zone. They gave testimony based on specialist knowledge and methods, scholarly research conducted from afar in labs and archives. Their remoteness from the war guaranteed their credibility by affording the overview and detachment associated with sound academic research methodology or professional respectability. And most even, of the tribunal's experts were medical doctors or natural scientists. I have focused on the professional historians who gave expert testimony mainly in Stockholm. And of particular, or in fact, the Russell Tribunal privileged history as the necessary epistemic framework or disciplinary tool for understanding and critiquing the war, its origins and causes. And of particular significance here was the American historian Gabriel Kolko, who wrote a report and testified before the Stockholm session. And then specifically, as Russ also alluded to, the possible connection to the Pentagon Papers that goes via Gabriel Kolko's report. And here he is on the far right with seated kind of among the Vietnamese delegates. And this is, I might return to the, okay, so this is just a couple of them. This is Gabriel Kolko testifying. And on the right there is just a really like dog-eared copy that I found in an archive. And I can also just mention, I found copies of like dog-eared copies of Kolko's report in every single tribunal participant's personal papers. So it was like a valuable document that was really used by movement people then for years to come in many different ways. But okay, Pentagon Papers, McNamara here on the left, obviously. So in June 1967, McNamara commissioned a secret study of the history of American involvement in Indochina since the Second World War. It was leaked to the press in '71 and dubbed the Pentagon Papers. And this secret study exposed the consistent lying of 4 consecutive administrations and confirmed the peace movement's critique of America's war in Vietnam. And plenty of journalism, scholarship, memoirs, and Hollywood films have examined the aftermath of the leak, or the mechanics of the leak itself, and the publication of the papers. And as you probably know, the affair's direct consequences include an epic showdown between establishment media and the White House, the Supreme Court ruling in favor of press freedom, and the formation of the White House plumbers, which forms an unbroken link from the Pentagon Papers affair to Nixon's resignation. Less direct effects of the Pentagon Papers leak include a drop in support for the war among the American public, and a measurable drop, and especially within the armed forces, in time effectively hobbling US fighting capacity and thus hastening an end to the war. So despite these dramatic ramifications of the Pentagon Papers affair, few scholars or journalists have explored why the Pentagon study existed in the first place. And even today, the study's origins remain mysterious. And in fact, McNamara's motivation for commissioning the study remains unclear, or was at the time, and remains unclear to those around him. And even after decades of historical scrutiny of this affair, a definitive origin story of the Pentagon study has proved elusive. So I'm going to offer a hypothesis. And I've reached this hypothesis by collating a plurality of sources, including Russell Tribunal testimony, declassified CIA memos, the memoirs of McNamara, the recollections of the Pentagon staff, and kind of piece together this timeline, which then leads me to this hypothesis for why McNamara commissioned the study that would become the Pentagon Papers. So in parallel to the tribunal Stockholm session in May 67, at just the same time, McNamara was in an intense disagreement with the military leadership and with President Johnson over Vietnam policy. And so in this situation, he was seeking empirical backing and evidence for his position that the war was unwinnable from the CIA, who were of the same position, kind of. So he started conferring closely with them on a daily basis with the CIA director, and asked them for evidence to help him in this conflict. And the CIA, in turn, had been closely monitoring the Russell Tribunal ever since it was first announced in summer '66. And the CIA submitted daily briefings, or often multiple briefings per day, from the Stockholm session to the Oval Office. Here's just one example, May 9th. And in typical, fashion of the U.S. government, they're kind of downplaying its significance and kind of gloating over that, it was, what do they say? It has gone rather badly. Anyway, it's the number one item on the president's daily brief. So, and this is just one example of dozens, only during the tribunal session period. These declassified CIA documents that were actually declassified thanks to Ralph Schoenman and his possibly litigious nature. These documents show that schedules, transcripts, and recordings of the Stockholm session were obtained by the CIA in the spring and summer of '67. And importantly, in several of these CIA cables that were distributed to various government agencies, Gabriel Kolko's name is highlighted, underlined, and circled. They often drew an asterisk by it also. It's very striking. And in fact, there are also many striking parallels between Kolko's expert testimony and the Pentagon Papers. I mean, the substance of them, including the title, the aim, the scope, the sources, and the conclusions. And considering that Kolko's expert testimony was primarily based on government records, it's perhaps not surprising that his narrative is consonant with the Pentagon Papers. Kolko and the other expert historians for the tribunal were aware of their then controversial revisionist position, and so they repeatedly emphasized that their arguments were based on official documents. And this was a rhetorical method favored by Bertrand Russell called evidence against interest. And on the whole, the Pentagon Papers, once they were leaked, confirmed and legitimized what anti-war scholars and protesters had been saying for years. And so the Pentagon Papers, of course, represent the ultimate evidence against interest. With their publication, the government itself became a conduit for anti-war critique. And scholars often, like scholars of the Vietnam War era, often say that the peace movement had no major influence, no immediate impact, altered neither government policy nor public opinion, and was ultimately a disappointment. And anti-war activists themselves were often despondent. Understandably, they felt a sense of urgency. The war was escalating, and so judged the results of their actions in a narrow time frame. And this is an excerpt from a letter from Ralph Schoenman to Russell Stettler a few months after, 2 months after the final session. So he said, and they're talking about Kolko, who was really upset with the tribunal because of all of its kind of internal conflicts. And Schoenman writes, Kolko's anger is a result of our failure to show the slightest political resort for all the efforts. His conviction as to the absolute and overriding importance of getting out the Stockholm material is what has lost Kolko to us. Kolko is beside himself with fury over the evidence of default, which has permitted us to involve hundreds of important people, hundreds of thousands of dollars, thousands of man-hours, great agonizing and political struggle, with a net result in the United States that could be contained in a bottle of piss. But in a long-term perspective, there's reason to re-examine the notion that the Russell Tribunal was ineffective. So while tribunal evidence indeed went underreported in the mainstream press, it did attract the scrutiny of US intelligence services. And I believe that the US government's surveillance of the tribunal had unintended consequences. In that they provided the animating spark for the Pentagon Papers. And so ironically, what Kolko was so upset, and this is what they're discussing in the letter, I believe. Kolko was so upset about the tribunal's apparent failure that he demanded to have his historical report withdrawn from the US edition of the published tribunal proceedings. While all the time there was a copy of it in the CIA library, kind of doing its work. But yeah, so again, this whole, like, the timeline I constructed of, like, okay, CIA, McNamara Tribunal, blah, 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 it's really hard to describe quickly, but and now it maybe sounds really flimsy, but there is some substance to it. But then you'll have to read the book. Okay, I'm going to say something about on-site investigators, which Russ also spoke about, and his work in ensuring their independence. But I'm going to look at a kind of ideological framework that nonetheless imbued their work, but that didn't have to do with, Communist Party membership or anything, but more like the zeitgeist, okay? So there were around, the Russell Tribunal sent around 10 investigative teams, primarily to North Vietnam, to collect evidence for the tribunal. And these on-site investigators were characterized by a combination of detachment and proximity. So they weren't parties to the war, nor implicated in the violence, but observed its consequences briefly at close range by examining victims and bomb sites. Most of them were also credentialed experts, like medical doctors, lawyers, scientists, but in their role of on-site investigators, practical experience on the ground eclipsed theoretical expertise, and they repeatedly emphasized their personal sensory and emotional experiences from the war zone. But I'm going to focus on a particular aspect of their testimony that struck me as odd, and which, I'll argue, was an effective material and ideological Cold War competition. So while the task of on-site investigators was to collect evidence of American violations of international law, a major part of their time in Vietnam was actually spent touring development projects, industries, healthcare facilities, agricultural co-ops, and cultural institutions that were not necessarily the targets of airstrikes. And in their reports, all on-site investigators put greater emphasis on the determination and resilience of the Vietnamese people than on their suffering and victimhood. So although the investigators were there to document war crimes, they often ended up minimizing war crimes, instead documenting North Vietnam's rapid development and modernization. So during the Cold War, post-colonial governments and anti-colonial movements sought domestic and international legitimacy by embracing the so-called moral imperative of progress, extolled by both superpowers. An American modernization theory, a social scientific model that studied the supposedly linear evolution of societies through a number of stages, leading inexorably to prosperity and freedom, had much in common with Leninism. It was actually devised as a kind of counter to Marxist Leninism, to appeal to third world peoples. And so both American modernization theory and Leninism viewed modernization as a totalizing and homogenizing phenomenon that proceeded in predetermined stages toward a society characterized not by national particularities, but organized around production, technology, education, and the application of science to everything. For third world socialists, prosperity and progress were inextricably linked to the struggle for self-determination. For example, in 1965, Che Guevara declared that, quote, "The struggle against imperialism is not unconnected with the struggle against backwardness and poverty. We must win the battle of development," end quote. And Leninist development ideology was firmly embedded in the political programs of Vietnamese revolutionaries. So modernization, productivity, and progress were not separate from Vietnam's war, but key aspects of it, which helps explain the tendency of tribunal investigators to paint a rosy picture of wartime Vietnam. So the tribunal's on-site investigators didn't highlight suffering individuals as much as a flourishing collective. A major part of on-site investigations were about projecting Vietnamese achievements, not vulnerabilities. And a close reading of the sources suggests a belief that modernity, industrialization, and social progress made North Vietnam and its people legitimate, grievable, and deserving of protection. The modernization ideology framework, adopted by tribunal investigators, stressed modernity and progress over bare humanity, or rather, modernity and progress made human lives valuable and grievable. And by the same token, America's destruction of Vietnamese infrastructure and industry and human capital, education and healthcare facilities, that was proof of American barbarism. And from a development ideology outlook, whether communist or capitalist, reversing progress in nation building was the cardinal sin. And there are countless examples of this throughout the tribunal material, from Vietnamese delegates and Western and non-Western fact finders. And relatedly, every single one of the injured Vietnamese victims who testified at the tribunal carefully stated their occupations, their parents' occupations, as well as the fact that US airstrikes had rendered them unable to work. So this suggests that their personal, and thus Vietnam's, diminished productive capacity was the major crime. So in sum, the tribunal's on-site investigative reports suggest that human life was made valuable and grievable through association with progress, productivity, and development by entering the realm of modernity and civilization. The North Vietnamese people and state were deserving of protection and empathy, not because they were weak, but because they were strong, because they represented positively coded values, modern, future-oriented, perhaps even Western. It, as one can see, is in the stressing of Catholics. Like there's an overrepresentation of Catholic victims and like bombed Catholic churches in all the reports. Development ideology explains why the Russell Tribunal's investigators' reports, which were meant to examine war crimes, are full of statistics on literacy, infant mortality, vaccination rates, industrial output, crop yields, university enrollment, etc. So in this view, America's most serious transgressions were those directed at productivity and state assets, especially symbols of modern benevolent nation building, such as state-of-the-art healthcare facilities and research centers. So reading the tribunal's on-site investigative reports from the perspective of modernization theory and Cold War competition renders them logical and rational. Okay, I was going to talk about perpetrators, but I don't have time. I was also going to talk about victims and their kind of epistemic dance with experts, how they kind of co-produced each other's knowledge about the war. But I don't have time, I think. Okay, a little bit. Okay, what? Okay, victims or perpetrators?
You make the call.
Perpetrators.
Okay. Okay, so I can just say, so for the perpetrator chapter, again, it's long, there's lots of findings there, but I want to tell you about one thing that one of my results or innovations that has come through this intense focus on witness testimony is that I suggest that the Russell Tribunal and its perpetrator witnesses kind of led to the emergence of a new witness figure that I call the moral perpetrator. And this, so I'm riffing off this idea of the moral witness, which is like established in some ethical philosophy or moral philosophy. And I'm devising this new figure, which then is represented or was kind of invented by these three American veterans who testified at the Roskilde session in Denmark in late '67. And so they all kind of described, they provided plenty of evidence on systematic violations of the laws of war, and they implicated themselves in war crimes. And this was despite the fact that for them, there was no real threat of prosecution, nor was there any incentive to testify. And this predated an organized veterans or GI movement. So their dissent was lonely, it was precarious, and they had little to gain by testifying. But they all spoke of how their experiences on the ground in Vietnam, they were all combat veterans, how that had set in motion a shift from complicit perpetrator to dissenting witness, culminating in this new kind of witness, the moral perpetrator. So like the moral witness, the moral perpetrator is one whose testimony has moral purpose, involves sacrifice, and plays a special role in exposing state-led violence, yet whose so-called dark knowledge of human-made suffering comes not from victimhood, as in the moral witness, but from perpetration. So these three veterans' acts of witness were entangled with their acts of violence. But still, so there were three of them, and they each offered their own kind of conversions, or actually their own dissent narrative. And so they offered these three frameworks or scripts for military dissent that could be described as morality, radical politics, or patriotism. So I'm just going to really briefly give examples of each. So this is Peter Martinson. He was 23 years old at the time, recently returned from the war zone. He had been a prisoner of war interrogator, that is a torturer, pretty much, who served in the 172nd Military Intelligence Detachment. And he framed his dissent in personal moral terms. He displayed vulnerability and expressed a kind of totalizing anti-war stance, as you can see here in this quote, that all wars beget war crimes and that anyone is capable of atrocity. So Martinson stands out for his grappling with morality and psychology. Next, we have 25-year-old David Tuck. He was a private, a grunt in the 1st Battalion, 35th Infantry Regiment, and he offered more of a structural critique and a collective perspective focused on racial dynamics within and beyond the military, and he highlighted the connection between dehumanizing language and indiscriminate violence. So his dissent was more political and deeply critical of American society and imperialism. And he had come to believe that the war was not a well-intentioned mistake, but a deliberate imperialist policy. And here in this quote, obviously, he's talking about the exploitation of minorities and underprivileged groups within the infantry specifically. And finally, there's Green Beret, or Special Forces Intelligence and Operations Specialist Donald Duncan, who was 37 at the time. And he also, like Tuck, kind of articulated a sociological and political critique, but with an entirely different flavor. So Duncan framed his dissent as a patriotic duty, an exercise in civic responsibility, and a defense of democratic values and American exceptionalism. He linked his conversion from perpetrator to moral witness to a kind of sociological trepidation for the future of his country. And I mean, he's incredibly eloquent, and I really recommend reading Duncan's statements, which he made in many different, because he was really like a big anti-war organizer for many years. Anyway, so these three together, they offered these three distinct, sometimes contradictory justifications for and models of dissent. So Duncan redefined patriotism, Tuck rejected patriotism, Martinson turned to morality and psychology. But I believe that their acts of witness created ethical and political subjectivities that didn't exist prior to them. So by accepting and embodying the role of reformed perpetrators, and by presenting themselves as culpable and complicit, they challenged existing narratives and categories, both pro-war and anti-war. So I want to end with this quote from Peter Martinson about what he's hoping to achieve. He says, "To the average American, a war crime is something incomprehensible. To him, it is inconceivable that Americans commit war crimes. Frankly, I'm the stereotype of an American college student. I want to show that it's not perhaps some long-haired freak who commits war crimes, but it's perhaps Mrs. Jones's son down the street. I'm hoping to develop that consciousness." So in this sense, the Russell Tribunal helped make American, not only Vietnamese suffering legible, but also American perpetration, right? And it was thanks to the Russell Tribunal setting that these personal stories were transformed into devices of collective political struggle. So although the veterans had been agents of violence, the Russell Tribunal recast their acts of violence as the basis for acts of moral witness. They became moral perpetrators, I suggest, and perhaps even agents of peace. At the very least, as I mentioned, they helped make American perpetration legible. And also, importantly, the Russell Tribunal, by having these three veterans it was the first time that there was this sustained coordination of like military dissent and the civilian anti-war movement, and the first time that veterans of the war spoke publicly about war crimes. So in this sense, the Russell Tribunal prepared the ground, last slide, for what became a vast movement of anti-war veterans and GI that bred mass rebellion within the armed forces and ultimately undercut US fighting power in Indochina. Okay, I have so much more to say, but I don't have time, so I'll end there. Unfortunately, the victims, didn't get theirs, which is kind of my whole point about the victims, is that they were peripheral to everything. So I'm reproducing that again. Apologies, but hopefully my book will come out in a few years, and then you can, if you're interested, you can see more about it then. Thank you.